From Microbe TV, this is Beyond the Noise, episode number 51, recorded on January 27, 2025. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and joining me today is your host, Dr. Paul Offit.
Hey, Vincent.
This is the video version of Paul's column on Substack called Beyond the Noise, cutting to the chase on important health topics. Today, we're going to have a closer look at Paul's last two columns about RFK Jr.'s Senate confirmation. So his hearing starts Wednesday. This will be our last effort to talk about the nonsense that he's promulgated. All right, so this comes in two parts, part 3 and part 4. First, RFK Jr. claims that AIDS wasn't widely spread, wasn't transmitted from person to person, was most likely caused by recreational drugs like poppers or antiviral drugs like AZT. Oh, what's his evidence for that? There are like 40 million people living with AIDS right now.
Right. And they have all, by PCR, been shown to be positive for human immunodeficiency virus. I mean, a Nobel Prize was awarded in 2008 to Luc Montagnier for discovering that HIV was the cause of AIDS. Because of antiretroviral drugs, meaning drugs directed against HIV, people with AIDS now live much longer than they did before. Those antiretroviral drugs save people's lives. So it is ironic that this man who might be the Secretary of Health and Human Services, is basically an AIDS denialist. It's a dangerous stance to take. It's an irresponsible stance to take. And what's interesting is that in the last few years, it's become a little more popular, this AIDS denialism, which was championed originally by some people like Peter Duesberg, which was amazing since he was an accomplished retrovirologist, and Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for the work he did on polymerase chain reaction, which in many ways, interestingly, was why we were able to make the diagnosis of AIDS unequivocally, or of HIV unequivocally in people who had AIDS.
So what would you ask him with respect to this stance?
I would say that in your book, you have said that you do not believe that HIV is the cause of AIDS. If that's true, as head of Secretary of HHS, will you restrict or eliminate antiretroviral drugs? Because you said also in your book that zidovudine, or AZT, which is used still in combination therapies for AIDS, was an example of, and I quote from you, mass murder. If you then think that antiretroviral drugs are an example of mass murder, are you going to restrict them or eliminate them here in the United States? And if you're not, then why did you say that in your book?
As you know, the administration just stopped funding for PEPFAR, which is a pre-exposure prophylaxis in Africa and many other countries. And so this may be a scepter of something to come, right?
Right. It's ironic. Bill Gates recently met with President Trump and talked about his interest in trying to eliminate AIDS from the world. That's his interest, Bill Gates. And he said that after that meeting, he was encouraged that President Trump had expressed an interest in that. And then Trump turns right around and at least suspends and possibly eliminates PEPFAR, which is AIDS to Africa, to try and ameliorate this pandemic. And that was a program that started in 2003, roughly. It's probably saved more than 20 million lives. So eliminating it is just an incredible example of irresponsibility and belies everything that Bill Gates is interested in doing and said he thought Trump was interested in doing.
Well, they claim that it's only a pause, but you can't pause PrEP. You'll get infected, right?
Exactly right. It's just irresponsible. And do we not understand at this point that what happens in the world does affect us, even if you just want to take a selfish view of this? It affects us.
All right. Now, this one is really out of this world. He doesn't believe in the germ theory of disease. What does that mean?
So it sounds fantastic that you would have to ask someone who is considered to be Secretary of Health and Human Services whether you believe in the germ theory. But this is what he says in his book, The Real Anthony Fauci. He says that in pages 285 to 291, that he doesn't believe essentially that specific germs like viruses or bacteria cause specific diseases, and that the prevention or treatment of those viruses or bacteria can be life-saving, which explains a lot. This explains why he doesn't believe that vaccines are beneficial, because why would preventing something like viruses or bacteria be of benefit if you don't believe that they're causing diseases? It explains why he doesn't believe that HIV is the cause of AIDS, because he doesn't believe in the germ theory, which is pretty much well established since about the late 1800s. So we've had about 150 years of proof that specific germs cause specific diseases, and if you treat them or prevent them, then you can save lives. It is remarkable to me, but it does explain a lot. It explains why he doesn't drink pasteurized milk, which puts him at risk of bacteria like salmonella or listeria or campylobacter E. coli. It does explain a lot. He's of the belief, rather, that all you need to do is maintain a healthy immune system by eating right, exercising, etc., and then you won't get sick. And he said that. He said healthy people don't die from these infections, which means he must have never spent a single day in a hospital, because it happens all the time.
Didn't you say that when he had a party at his house, he made everyone get immunized against SARS-CoV-2?
That's right. I think it was in December 2021. So you were about a year into the development of a vaccine, or the availability of a vaccine. And he said that you couldn't go to his home for a Christmas party unless you were vaccinated. He said later, trying to explain it, well, that wasn't me, that was my wife. So hard to watch.
So what would you ask him about this idea of the germ theory of disease?
Do you really believe that specific viruses or bacteria don't cause specific diseases, and that the prevention of those viruses or bacteria is of value? Because you say in your book that you believe in the miasma theory, something that was popular in Europe in the 1700s, that was based on the belief that when organic material, garbage, was rotting on the streets and would then deteriorate, that it would release this bad air, if you will, this miasma, which could cause disease unless your immune system was in good shape, in which case it wouldn't. So that's where this all comes from. I think he believes that vaccines are that toxin that's causing children to have chronic diseases. And he believes that then by removing that toxin, in this case vaccines, that you are doing good. And he really believes that. This is at the heart of everything he believes. That's why he's so zealous about it. He's such a fighter, is he believes that vaccines are hurting children, because he doesn't believe that preventing specific viruses or bacteria is of value. All you have to do is just eat well, exercise, sort of avoid unhealthy foods, and then you won't have to worry about any of this.
So he thinks this is the case, and many, many thousands of scientists clearly believe that germs cause disease. So what are his qualifications to go against this general belief?
He's a science denialist. He just has these fixed beliefs. He continues to believe vaccines cause autism, even though study after study shows that's not true. And when you show him those studies, he doesn't believe them. He thinks that the big pharma is just controlling the government and controlling the medical establishment and controlling the journals. He also blames the journals for publishing articles that refute his fixed, immutable, science-resistant beliefs.
Okay. Next, this is from part 4. RFK Jr. has stated that SARS-CoV-2 was ethnically targeted.
COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately.
What does that mean?
Right. So not only does he believe that the virus, SARS-CoV-2, was created in a laboratory, which clearly isn't true, he believes that further, that it was targeted to spare certain groups and attack certain groups. The groups that he said it would attack are Caucasians and blacks, and the groups that it spares are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. So this is based on a study that was published actually in 2020, before there was the pandemic really hit hard, and certainly before we had vaccines to prevent it. And he believed that if you looked, that there's certain polymorphisms, genetic differences between sort of proteins onto which the cell binds, and that those polymorphisms can differ according to certain groups. But that says nothing about the individual, because those polymorphisms, could affect 1 in 10,000 people, 1 in 100,000 people. So the notion that it's targeted for Ashkenazi Jews or targeted to spare Ashkenazi Jews or spare Chinese is just silly. I think what we've learned now that we're into this pandemic, 6 years into this pandemic, is that you are at risk if you're unvaccinated. You're at risk if you have medical problems that put you in a high risk group, and you're at risk if you're older. Those are the risk factors. It has nothing to do with your ethnic or racial background. Otherwise, this virus is an equal opportunity employer.
So what would you ask him about this?
I would say, do you still believe that's true? Given everything we know right now, do you still believe that's true? And if so, why? And what are your data? And if he points again to that scientific study, hopefully there'll be somebody on the panel that's questioning him who has enough to ask him about this. But see, this is the problem. I mean, he will sit at this meeting, and he's, as you said at the beginning, he's going to be meeting in front of the Finance Committee on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, which is January 29th. He's going to be meeting in front of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee the following day on January 30th. And and he will spout his misinformation, and he'll sort of frame it in a scientific way that makes it sound like it's right. But the people who are going to be asking him those questions don't really have what it takes to counter that. It's not like he's appearing before a panel of scientists or epidemiologists or virologists or vaccine experts. He's appearing before congressmen, senators who don't know really much about this. And so in many ways, it would be very hard to watch that meeting, which is why I'm not going to watch it.
Yeah, so that paper is basically wrong. And subsequent experience with infections has shown it to be so. But, he can waive it and say it was published that this is the case, and they won't get it.
Right, and he does that all the time. Probably his most famous example, he believed that thimerosal, this ethyl mercury-containing preservative in vaccines, caused autism, or it certainly caused brain damage. So he always points to this one paper. It's by Thomas Burbacker and colleagues. And he says, look at the Burbacker paper. Here was a paper where they inoculated infant monkeys with thimerosal at the level that would be contained in vaccines. And what they found when they looked at these animals is that there was massive amounts of inflammation at levels they'd never seen before. And he says that. He says that all the time. He said it on Joe Rogan's show. He said it when he gives talks to like the Amish community in suburban Philadelphia. He says that all the time. Look at the Burbacker paper. Look at the Burbacker paper. It doesn't say that at all. It says that the animals were fine. It said that when they were exposed to methyl mercury, which is environmental mercury and certainly can cause brain damage, that there was evidence of damage, but not with ethyl mercury, not with thimerosal. But he says that because he knows nobody's going to look at the paper. And he knows certainly nobody on a panel like that would have looked at the paper. So no one can refute him. So Joe Rogan's not going to refute him. I mean, what you'd like to do is hand him that paper and say, here, show me where in this paper it says that, because it doesn't say that. And that's how he gets away with this.
Well, the Republican committee members will tell him, you don't have to do that, Mr. Kennedy. They'll protect him. Okay, here's an interesting one. He has linked chemicals in the water supply to transgender identity.
And so the capacity for these chemicals that we are just raining down on our children right now to induce these very profound sexual changes in them is something we need to be thinking about as a society.
What is this all about?
Right. So he sort of points to pesticides, drugs like atrazine, which he says that in experimental animals, frogs, it shows that it could cause, the frogs to be transgender. I don't know how you would know that exactly, but in any case. But it actually points out to something that's critical for how he thinks about things. If there's ever a study that's done, say, in laboratory cells or in experimental animals, he believes that then is a truth. And so there you have it. He does the same thing, for example, with this notion that the oral polio vaccine, the ones Albert Sabin and Jonas Salk's vaccines in the late 50s and early 60s, which were contaminated with simian virus 40 or SV40, that when that SV40 was inoculated into experimental animals like hamsters and caused cancers, that therefore must mean it caused a ton of cancers, or as he said, many, many, many more cancers in man, whereas that was never true in epidemiological studies then 5 years later, 8 years later, 15 years later, 30 years later. So what happens in experimental animals or what happens in laboratory cells is not necessarily predictive of what happens in man, right? As you said on This Week in Virology, mice lie and monkeys exaggerate. If mice were predictive of man, we would have had an AIDS vaccine about 40 years ago. But to him, that's a proof. And that's yet another reason where he gets the science wrong.
Or would you ask him about this topic?
Sure, because first of all, there's evidence showing that that's not true. That that these chemicals don't cause transgender or gender dysphoria, as he's tried to claim. And but it's all part of his general theme that there are toxins in the environment that are causing horrible things, or at least in his mind, horrible things. And so whether it's talking about pesticides or Roundup, or mercury, or vaccines. Those are all the toxins. And if you want to avoid all that, just lead a clean and healthy life, and you won't have to suffer any of it.
He claims that mass shootings are caused by the increased use of antidepressants. Is there evidence for that?
No, there's evidence against that. There was actually a paper published showing that that's not true at all. That if you look at these mass shootings, it has nothing to do with that. But again, does science matter? Does doing the studies matter? And I think it does, in the sense that when the notion was brought up that, for example, vaccines caused autism in the late 1990s, there were studies that were done to look to see whether it was true, right? It's fair to ask the question. My child was fine. They got a vaccine. Now they're not fine. In this case, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. So there's been more than a dozen studies showing that. Well, at the time that issue was raised, 90% of parents of children with autism believed that vaccines could have caused their child's autism. Today, it's closer to 10 to 15%. So while the issue hasn't gone away, doing those studies does help. And it sort of gives arms, clinicians and researchers who are trying to explain these things to people, and in this case, to committees, the information that they need. But once you've rung a bell, it's really hard to unring it.
And lastly, he claims that malaria and meningitis vaccines killed children and sterilized women. Is there evidence for that?
Yeah, in Africa. And see, this what's particularly awful about this. Efforts to bring vaccines into Africa are often stymied by local myths about why the West is bringing vaccines there. And that's one of them, that vaccines are just there to sterilize people so that we can have fewer people in Africa. And that's just wholly irresponsible, because things like the malaria vaccine or like the meningitis vaccine, especially in sub-Saharan Africa for meningitis, are life-saving. And so what does he do? All he does is cast doubt when vaccines that are life-saving. It is so hard to watch this. And I just feel like we're falling off a cliff in slow motion.
In fact, malaria vaccines are relatively new, so I'm not sure you would see an effect so soon.
Of course. And we can make a better malaria vaccine. I think we're in the process of making better malaria vaccine.
It's just, to scientists, it's just remarkable that he says these things and apparently we'll get away with them.
Well, I'd like to believe that good science does win out in the end, and that no matter how many times he repeats things that are wrong, that ultimately good science does win out. But I'm an optimist.
It's just crazy that politics trumps science, right?
So to speak.
That's Beyond the Noise with Dr. Paul Offit. We'll put a link to Beyond the Noise in the show notes. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.